There is a stretch of Flamingo Road in Las Vegas where, on the night of September 7th, 1996, a white Cadillac pulled alongside a black BMW and opened fire. 4 bullets, one of the most famous men on the planet bleeding in the passenger seat, and a city that saw everything and said nothing. Vegas has buried a lot of secrets in that desert sand, but this one might be the deepest. Hi, my name is Michael, and this is Old Vegas Legends, the empire before the fall. And to understand what was really happening in Vegas that September weekend, you have to understand what Tupac Shakur had become by 1996. And I mean really understand it, not the legend, not the posters on dorm room walls, the business. Because by the summer of 1996, Tupac wasn't just a rapper, he was an industry, a one-man economy with enough creative output to power a record label for a decade after his death, which, as it turns out, is exactly what happened. But we'll get to that. Tupac Amaru Shakur had signed with Death Row Records in October of 1995, released from prison on a $2.4 million bail bond posted by Death Row founder Marion Suge Knight. That bail bond wasn't charity, it was a contract. Tupac signed a 3-album deal with Death Row, and the terms were, depending on who you ask, either standard industry practice or the most lopsided arrangement in the history of recorded music. Knight took the publishing. Knight controlled the masters. Knight owned the machinery that produced the most valuable artist on the planet. In the 12 months between his prison release and his death, Tupac recorded an almost incomprehensible volume of music. We're talking somewhere between 100 and 150 songs. Some estimates run higher. He worked 20-hour sessions. He'd walk into the studio at midnight and walk out at noon the next day with 3 finished tracks. Engineers who worked with him at Death Row's Can-Am studios in Tarzana described a man who seemed to understand, on some level, that time was short. Whether that was instinct or paranoia, or just raw creative hunger, nobody can say for certain. But the result was a vault. A massive, overflowing, extraordinarily valuable vault of unreleased material that, by the summer of 1996, was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million. Conservative estimate. Some say more. And who owned that vault? Suge Knight owned that vault. That's the number you need to keep in your head as we walk through what happened next. Now, here is something the mainstream coverage of Tupac's death almost never mentions. By late 1996, Tupac was trying to get out. He'd spent a year at Death Row. He'd seen how the money moved, or more accurately, how it didn't move in his direction. He'd watched royalty statements that didn't add up. He had a lawyer, Kenner, looking at the contract, pulling at threads. And from what people close to him have said in the years since, Tupac was planning to launch his own label, Machiavelli Records. He even had a name for it, borrowed from Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher whose work Tupac had consumed in prison. A man who wrote extensively about power, deception, and how rulers maintain control. You cannot make this stuff up. The Vegas trip that September weekend was supposed to be about the fight. Mike Tyson versus Bruce Seldon at the MGM Grand. That part everybody knows. But there was business happening that weekend too. Real business, the kind that gets discussed in hotel suites and hallways and over late dinners. Not in boardrooms. The kind of business that, if it had gone through, would have changed everything for everyone involved. And Suge Knight knew exactly what was at stake. Why Vegas? Why that night? Let me set the scene for you. September 7th, 1996. Las Vegas is doing what Las Vegas does. The MGM Grand is packed to capacity for the Tyson fight. $40,000 a ringside seat. Celebrities everywhere. The city is electric in the way it only gets when money and danger are sharing a room. Tupac flew in from Los Angeles on a private jet. He was in good spirits by most accounts. He was wearing a vest. He took it off because of the heat. That detail will matter later. It always matters later. The details you can't change. The fight itself was almost comically brief. Tyson knocked out Seldon in 109 seconds of the first round. The crowd barely had time to settle into their seats. And afterward, in the lobby of the MGM Grand, something happened that started a chain reaction nobody could stop. A man named Orlando Anderson, a member of the Southside Crips from Compton, was spotted in the lobby. Anderson had allegedly been involved in a robbery of a Death Row associate named Trayvon Lane, stealing a Death Row medallion. When members of Tupac's entourage saw Anderson, they pointed him out. And then Tupac, along with Suge Knight and a group of death row associates, attacked him, right there, in the lobby of the MGM Grand, on camera, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. This is a man who was under active investigation by law enforcement, who was the most recognizable face in music, attacking someone on camera in a casino lobby in Las Vegas. Las Vegas, where the cameras never stop recording. The footage exists. The LVMPD reviewed it. And yet, somehow, in the investigation that followed the shooting, Orlando Anderson was interviewed and released. No charges were ever filed for the lobby assault. That is Vegas doing what Vegas does, but I'm getting ahead of myself. After the fight, after the lobby confrontation, Tupac and the death row entourage went back to the Luxor Hotel. There were parties being planned. Suge Knight's Solar Entertainment Company had a party scheduled at Club 662, a venue Knight owned, the name being a phone keypad spelling of M-O-B. Tupac was going to perform. It was going to be a night. Everyone said so. The convoy of cars left the Luxor somewhere around 11 o'clock that night, heading toward Club 662. Suge Knight was driving his black BMW 750 Li. Tupac was in the passenger seat. No security vehicle, no chase car. Suge Knight, one of the most prominent and controversial figures in the music industry, driving through Las Vegas at night with his most valuable asset in the front seat. And no security detail following behind. Chew on that for a moment. At the intersection of Flamingo Road and Koval Lane at approximately 11:15 at night, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside them at a red light. Someone rolled down the window. 12 shots were fired from a .40 caliber handgun. 4 of them hit Tupac, 2 in the chest, 1 in the arm, 1 in the thigh. Suge Knight was grazed by a bullet fragment in the head. The BMW kept moving. Suge drove it several blocks before stopping. When police and paramedics arrived, Tupac was conscious and combative. He was taken to the University Medical Center of Southern Nevada. He was 25 years old. The last 24 hours. Here is where the story gets quiet, and quiet in Las Vegas is always more frightening than loud. Tupac was admitted to the University Medical Center in critical condition. He underwent emergency surgery. His right lung had to be removed. The next 6 days, from September 8th through September 13th, 1996, are the 6 days that the mainstream narrative of Tupac's death almost completely skips over. The media was focused on whether he would survive, on vigils outside the hospital, on statements from his mother, Tupac Shakur, who flew in from Atlanta, on the back and forth with East Coast media about what the shooting meant for the so-called hip-hop beef. But inside certain offices in Los Angeles, inside certain conversations happening between lawyers and accountants and music industry power brokers, something else entirely was taking place. The vault was being discussed, that 100+ songs of unreleased material, the masters, the publishing, the contract that Tupac had been trying to renegotiate. Because here is the brutal mathematics of the music business that nobody likes to say out loud. A living Tupac trying to leave death row was a legal problem for Suge Knight. A dead Tupac was a $10 million asset with no one to dispute the contract terms. I'm not saying Suge Knight ordered the shooting. I want to be very clear about that. What I am saying is that the financial architecture that existed around Tupac Shakur in September of 1996 created a situation where certain people had more to gain from his death than from his survival. And that is a fact. A cold, uncomfortable, documented fact. During those 6 days, visitors came and went from the hospital. Tupac Shakur was there. Members of the death row family rotated through. Faith Evans, Tupac's estranged friend, and the wife of his supposed rival, the notorious B.I.G., reportedly sent flowers. What is more interesting is, who was not managing the crisis in the way you'd expect? Where were the lawyers? Where was the documentation? Where was anyone sitting down with Tupac Shakur and explaining exactly what her son's contractual situation was, what she would be entitled to, what death row controlled, what she didn't? Those conversations were not happening. Or, if they were, they weren't happening with Tupac in the room. On September 13th, 1996, at 4:16 in the afternoon, Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. He'd been in Las Vegas for less than 48 hours when the shots were fired. He never left the city, and the $10 million secret he was carrying, the vault, the contract, the attempted exit from death row, all of it, stayed in Las Vegas with him. The 6 days nobody talks about now, let's talk about the money, because this is the part of the story that gets dressed up in grief and gunsmoke and never examined clearly. So let's examine it clearly. When Tupac died, the ownership of his recorded catalog was governed by his death row contract. Suge Knight's label controlled the masters of everything Tupac recorded during his time there. That included All Eyes on Me, the double album released in February of 1996 that sold over 5 million copies in its first year. It included the Machiavelli album, recorded in secret under a pseudonym, which Knight released in November of 1996, just 2 months after Tupac died. And it included The Vault, that enormous backlog of unreleased material. Now, here is where the accounting gets interesting, and by interesting I mean genuinely suspicious. Death Row Records was, by 1996, one of the most financially opaque organizations in the American music industry. The label was privately held. There were no public filings. Knight ran it like a personal fiefdom, and the money that flowed through it, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue from Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac, flowed in ways that auditors would later describe as, and I'm being diplomatic here, difficult to trace. Multiple former death row employees and artists have said they never saw royalty statements that reflected anything close to what the label was actually earning. After Tupac's death, Afeni Shakur fought for years to understand exactly what her son had been owed. She eventually won control of his likeness and certain assets through the estate, establishing Amaru Entertainment to manage his posthumous catalog. But the death row masters, the recordings from 1995 and 96, those remained a source of legal dispute for years. Knight continued releasing Tupac material throughout the late 90s and into the 2000s, generating millions of dollars in revenue from a man who was no longer alive to question the accounting. 7 posthumous albums. 7. Between 1996 and 2006. Think about that. More albums after he died than he released while he was alive. The $10 million figure I keep referencing comes from estimates made by music industry analysts in the late 90s about the value of the unreleased death row vault at the time of Tupac's death. Some estimates, accounting for the way that catalog has been monetized since, run considerably higher. We're talking about an asset that has generated revenue for nearly 3 decades, and the original ownership of that asset was secured in the most ironclad possible way, by the terms of a contract signed in a prison visitor's room in 1995, signed by a man who had no choice but to sign it, because the alternative was staying in prison. That's not a music deal. That's a different word entirely. I'll let you pick which one. The $10 million secret. Let me talk to you now about the specific shape of what was being hidden, because the $10 million figure is not just a round number I picked for dramatic effect. It represents something real and documented, even if the full picture has never been formally assembled in a courtroom or a public accounting. By the summer of 1996, Death Row Records was grossing somewhere between $100 and $150 million annually. That is not a typo. The label had Dr. Dre's The Chronic from 1992, which never stopped selling. It had Snoop Dogg. It had a roster of artists that dominated radio. And at the center of all of it, the newest and brightest and most commercially explosive piece of the machine was Tupac. All Eyes on Me had debuted at number 1. It was on track to become one of the best-selling rap albums in history, and Tupac was already recording its follow-up, and the follow-up to that, and material beyond that. The specific clause that Tupac's legal team was examining in the summer of 1996 was a recording fund clause, standard in major label contracts of that era, which essentially meant that the costs of recording, studio time, producers, engineers were recouped against the artist's royalties before the artist saw a cent. On paper, Tupac could be the best-selling rapper in America and still owe Death Row money, because the costs of his recordings were being charged back to his royalty account at a rate that his actual royalty percentage could never outpace. This is not unusual in the music industry. It is, however, a particularly effective way of ensuring that an artist never accumulates enough leverage to walk away. And Tupac, who was not a naive man, had figured this out. He was furious about it. He'd said so publicly. He'd said so privately. He was done with death row, and death row knew it. The value of the unreleased vault in this context was not just the raw catalog value of the recordings. It was the leverage those recordings represented. If Tupac left death row and launched Machiavelli Records, he would be launching it with no back catalog, because death row owned everything he'd recorded. Every song in the vault, every track he'd laid down in those 20-hour sessions, every collaboration, every experiment, every finished and half-finished piece of work. It all stayed with Knight. That was the financial trap, and the only way out of it was a legal battle that would have taken years and cost millions and produced headlines that neither side particularly wanted. His death solved that problem completely, permanently, without a single day in court. Vegas, swallowed it. Now let's talk about Las Vegas, because Vegas is as much a character in this story as any human being. And Vegas played its role with the kind of quiet, practiced efficiency that this city has spent 70 years perfecting. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department opened a homicide investigation into Tupac's shooting within hours of it happening. They had the MGM Grand Lobby footage of the earlier assault. They had witnesses on Flamingo Road, dozens of people who'd seen the white Cadillac. They had Orlando Anderson, who multiple witnesses placed in connection with the crime. They had a city full of surveillance cameras and a world full of people willing to talk. And the investigation went nowhere. Now, I want to be fair here, because cold cases are genuinely hard. Witnesses in gang-related shootings don't cooperate. Evidence gets contaminated. The timeline is complicated. I understand all of that. But the LVMPD investigation into Tupac's murder was not merely unsuccessful. It was, by the accounts of multiple journalists, independent investigators, and even some retired law enforcement personnel who've spoken about it in the years since, remarkably incurious. Witnesses described being interviewed once and never contacted again. Physical evidence, including the bullet casings recovered from the scene, was cataloged, but the follow-up investigative work that should have flowed from it simply didn't happen with any urgency. Seaman retired LAPD detective Greg Kading, who spent years investigating both Tupac's and Biggie's murders as part of a task force, published findings suggesting the shooting was ordered by Crips gang member Keffe D, aka Dwayne Davis, and carried out by his nephew Orlando Anderson, who died in an unrelated gang shooting in 1998. Keffe D himself, in an extraordinary turn of events, published a memoir in 2023 in which he essentially admitted to involvement in planning the attack. He was arrested in Las Vegas in September 2023 and charged with murder with a deadly weapon. 27 years after the shooting. 27 years. Keffe D is currently awaiting trial as of this recording. So the case is technically no longer cold, but it took 27 years and a man writing a book bragging about it to get there. That tells you everything you need to know about the urgency with which Las Vegas pursued this investigation. And the financial side of the story, the contract, the vault, the $10 million question of who owned what and how the accounting worked. Nobody investigated that. Not the LVMPD, not the FBI, not the IRS, at least not in any way that produced public results. Las Vegas is very good at letting certain questions stay unanswered. The city was built by men who understood that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do with information is leave it in the ground. What happened to everyone? So what happened to everyone? Let's go through it, because this is always the part that matters. Suge Knight. Knight continued running Death Row Records until the label's financial collapse in the early 2000s. Federal investigators examined Death Row's finances as part of broader organized crime investigations. Knight was convicted of voluntary manslaughter in 2018 for a separate incident, a fatal hit-and-run in Compton in 2015, and is currently serving a 28-year prison sentence. He has never been charged in connection with Tupac's murder. He has given interviews over the years that range from enigmatic to outright bizarre on the subject. In one, he suggested Tupac might still be alive. You know, he said that with a straight face. I genuinely do not know what to do with that either. Tupac Shakur spent the years after her son's death fighting for control of his legacy with a ferocity that deserves genuine respect. She established Amaru Entertainment, named after her son's full first name, and worked to ensure that the posthumous releases were handled with artistic integrity rather than purely as cash extractions. She was not always successful. Some of the posthumous material was assembled and released in ways that Tupac's closest collaborators felt were beneath his standard. But Afeni fought. She died in May 2016, at 69 years old, still managing her son's estate, still fighting. The estate continues under the management of trustees. Orlando Anderson, the man most investigators believe pulled the trigger, was killed in a gang-related shooting in Compton in May 1998. He was 23 years old. He never faced trial for Tupac's murder. He denied involvement until his death. The Death Row Vault, those 100-plus recordings, has been monetized continuously since 1996 through a succession of owners. Death Row Records itself went bankrupt in 2006, and its assets were sold. The label and its catalog were purchased by entertainment company MNRK Music Group in 2022. The Tupac material in that catalog continues to generate revenue. Streaming, licensing, samples, documentary soundtracks. 27 years later, that vault is still producing, still valuable, still, in certain ways, still contested. And Las Vegas? Las Vegas built new hotels, tore down old ones. The stretch of Flamingo Road where the shooting happened looks like it always did. There's no marker, no memorial. The city doesn't do memorials for things it wants to forget. You drive past it and you'd never know. Just another block, just another light, just another corner where something happened that the desert decided to keep. Here's what I want to leave you with. And this is the part where Michael steps out from behind the script for just a second. Because I've spent a lot of time with this story, reading the court documents, the investigative journalism, the biographies, the financial records that exist in the public domain. And what strikes me, what keeps striking me, is how perfectly this story fits the template of every other story we tell on this channel. Think about it. A man builds something extraordinary, an empire of creative output, of cultural power, of raw financial value. And the people around him, the people who controlled the machinery that made the empire run, were positioned to benefit more from his death than from his success. That's the Binion story. That's the Stardust story. That's the story of every dynasty built in this desert. The house always wins. But sometimes the house is not a casino. Sometimes the house is a record label. Sometimes the house is a contract, signed in a prison visiting room. Sometimes the house is the entire city of Las Vegas, looking the other way while the counting happens in a back room. Tupac Shakur was 25 years old. He had recorded enough music to release albums for a decade after his death. He was trying to take back control of his work. He came to Las Vegas for a boxing match and never went home. And the financial architecture that surrounded him, the $10 million vault, the contract he was trying to escape, the label that owned his output, all of it was resolved cleanly and completely by his death. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think there's a room somewhere where a single person planned all of this. What I do think is that Las Vegas has a particular talent for creating conditions where certain truths never fully emerge, where investigations lose urgency, where financial questions go unasked, where the city keeps moving, building higher and brighter, and the secrets stay exactly where they were left. Benny Binion once said that the most important thing in Vegas was your word. That trust was the only currency that actually mattered. He was talking about gambling, but it applies here too, because what happened to Tupac Shakur in this city was a failure of trust on every level. The trust between an artist and a label, the trust between a city and the truth, the trust that when someone is gunned down in your streets, you pursue justice with everything you have, not just until it becomes inconvenient. Keffi D is in a Las Vegas courtroom waiting for trial, 27 years later. Maybe the truth is finally coming. Maybe Vegas is finally going to reckon with what happened on Flamingo Road on a September night in 1996. Maybe. This city has surprised me before. Not often, but before. The $10 million secret they buried with Tupac is not really about the money. It never was. It's about what the money represented: control, freedom, the right of an artist to own what he created, the right of a 25-year-old man to walk away from a bad deal and build something for himself. He never got that right. In Las Vegas, the city of reinvention and erasure and neon over everything, made sure the question stayed buried. Every legend has a story, and Vegas never forgets. It just decides what to remember.